you're on a reasonably low risk situation, a single application, around growth stage 31 or thereabouts, which is round about now of a CCC modus mix or a CCC Medax max mix can be pretty effective in reducing your risk. If you're in a higher risk situation, you might go to a 2 application strategy where you put on a litre of CCC with 0.2 of a modus type product or 0.2 or 0.3 of Medax max and at growth stage 30 and come back again around growth stage 31 with a second split.
The longer days, bright sunshine and warm temperatures have triggered a burst of growth in all crops. Cereals are actively taking up nitrogen and other nutrients, expanding their leaf area and progressing quickly through growth stages. With careful management, especially to ensure crops remain standing until harvest, there is an excellent yield potential in the fields this year. You're listening to the latest episode of the Tillage Edge with me, Michael Hennessy. I would really appreciate it if you could listen, follow and give us a review on Apple or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts from. I'm delighted today to be joined by Dr. Richie Hackett, a researcher in Teagasc Oak Park, to discuss some crop agronomy, especially focusing on crop growth and growth regulation. Richie, I just wanted to start off by just asking, why should farmers consider using PGRs in their cereal crops?
Well, I suppose the principal reason for using growth regulators is to prevent lodging. We all know that lodging, when it occurs, is not good. So you're going to lose yield because of poor light interception, but you're also going to lose quality. And particularly if you have a wet harvest, it's going to be really difficult to harvest and slow down the harvest. And it's all around, it's not good. So we want to try to avoid lodging as much as possible. And growth regulators are one of the tools we have to reduce the risk of lodging.
Okay, and as you mentioned there, there's probably a good few factors involved in the why a particular crop or variety might fall over. You might maybe just step us through a few of those.
Well, I suppose as you said, there's a number of reasons or a number of factors that play into it. I suppose the first one is variety. Variety has a large impact on what the risk of lodging. And we all know that the Department of Agriculture assess all the varieties, and one of the assessments they make on those varieties is how lodging prone they are. And on the recommended list, all the varieties are given a score. And that should be the grower's first port of call. Both at this stage, but also I would say before the crops were sown, if you're going into a high risk situation, maybe you should look at choosing a strong standing variety, a variety that's not prone to lodging. Whereas if you're going into a less risky situation, you've a bigger choice. But at this stage, before a grower goes out to design his growth regulator program, he should look at what variety he has and decide whether it's a high risk or low risk variety. And there are big differences, particularly in winter wheat at the moment. There are a couple of varieties there that are relatively more prone to lodging than the other varieties. So that's quite important. The field conditions are also very important. The closer to, if you're growing a crop that's close to grass, it's going to be a very fertile site. That's more likely to be a lodging risk situation than a long-term tillage situation. The amount of nitrogen you're using, high nitrogen inputs are going to increase the risk of lodging. Your sowing date, particularly for winter crops, the earlier you sow the winter crop, it's going to be that bit more advanced coming into the spring, likely to be a little bit more thicker as well. That will increase the lodging risk. And also your seeding rate, higher seeding rates will give an increased risk of lodging. So there's a lot of factors to take into account when you're deciding how at risk your crop is of lodging.
Okay, and I suppose maybe just to boil that down, maybe for somebody might out there, would the likes of as you mentioned, winter wheat there, Champion, which probably has the lodging scores will be a bit lower than other varieties, that was sown early in a high fertility site. That's you're probably getting into the very high risk scenario there, Richie.
That would be probably your highest risk situation. Whereas if it's something like Dawson, which is a better variety in terms of lodging resistance, it's a less risky situation, particularly if you have it in a less fertile site.
And Richie, just in terms of lodging, there's a couple of different types of lodging, isn't there? Which people probably should be trying to take into account as well.
You have stem lodging and you have root lodging. So often when you go and look at the crop and it's lodged, you don't really take much notice of it, whether it's the stem is actually buckled or whether it's the whole root plate has twisted in the soil. But that it can make a difference. So if you have a really strong stem, and you get a windy night on a variety, and a windy wet night, and the soil gets very wet, it'll transfer all the force into the roots, and if the roots aren't strong enough, they'll just turn in the soil, and the stem doesn't actually break. It's the whole root ball twists in the soil. So yeah, that can have an impact, and the management you do to reduce those can be slightly different. So for example, if you don't roll a crop, it can increase the risk of root lodging, and rolling will reduce that risk, but rolling will have very little effect on stem lodging. So you have slightly different management effects on both types of lodging.
So the real kind of, I suppose, levers that you can pull are plant growth regulators to try and manipulate that the plant itself. But before we get into that, how big of a factor does nitrogen play in trying to reduce that lodging risk?
Quite a large influence, particularly where you're using very high rates of nitrogen. So if you're going for high yields and using high rates of nitrogen, and particularly if you're applying that nitrogen early, you're causing very dense canopies early in the season. That's reducing the amount of light getting down low into the crop, and that sort of stimulates the crop to produce thinner, less strong stems, and therefore it increases the risk of lodging later in the season. So nitrogen is particularly important, and how you manage nitrogen. I suppose sort of one of the smaller crops like rye, I would say nitrogen is very, very important, probably more important than growth regulator in terms of keeping that crop standing.
And I suppose, Richie, there's the other factor that people should really be aware of: the organic manures that might be underneath those crops. I mean, there's quite a bit of chicken manure or poultry manure, I suppose, used in crops, which has a pretty high nitrogen content to be taken account of.
Absolutely, and if you don't, like we did some work it was with pig slurry, but the same would go for poultry slurry or for poultry manure. If you don't take account of the nitrogen in that, you're basically over fertilizing your crop and increasing the risk. And I suppose the other thing to remember about organic manures is where you're using them over and over and over and over again, you're building up the organic nitrogen in the soil, and you're increasing the background fertility of the soil, and you should, where you're using them repeatedly, so over a long number of years, you should probably take that into account as well.
Going back to PGRs then, plant growth regulators, how do they function within a plant to reduce the risk of lodging?
Well, I suppose within plants have a bit like ourselves. Plants have various types of hormones in them that cause the cells when the plant is growing, they cause the cells to do different things. And I suppose in terms of how we manage our crops, the two main groups are things called gibberellins and ethylene. And what gibberellins do is they basically make the cells in the stem go longer, and that increases the height of the crop. So ideally, we want to try and stop the crop from producing those gibberellins. The ethylene, which is the other hormone that's important from our point of view, stops the cells from elongating, and in so doing, it shortens the crop. So in terms of the actual growth regulators that we use, there's sort of two main groups. There's groups that stop those gibberellins that I spoke about being produced. So they just stop those gibberellins being manufactured within the plant, and therefore that stops the shoot from elongating. And the other group is ones that actually produce ethylene in the plant, and that stops the shoot from elongating. So that they're the main processes within the plant that the growth regulators are affecting. You have this group that stops gibberellins being produced, and this other group of growth regulators that we use that produce ethylene when they get into the plant and have their effect there.
Okay, so farmers probably are fairly familiar with probably a lot of the major products out there, whether it's Cycocel or Trexipacbine modus or Turple that's out there or Cerrone, they're all in fairly familiar to most people out there. But is there, and we'll get into, when you should use and that kind of stuff. But in terms of effectiveness, Richie, for using those PGR products, is there areas where people should consider, delaying the use of them or don't use them at all?
Conditions that you apply them in, all the products can be effective if they're applied in good conditions. And I suppose that the conditions you need to look out for are particularly crops under stress. Not such a good idea to be applying growth regulators to crops that are under a lot of stress. Be that drought stress, doesn't often happen this time of year, but it can happen, or some nutrient stress, or some other waterlogging stress or whatever. And then the other I suppose, place that you would think about not using them immediately is where there's large swings in temperature between day and night, as has happened over a number of days in the past week or 10 days or so. You avoid using them, particularly where you've 8-10 degree swings in temperature, and where the lower end of that swing is, you're getting grass frosts. That's not such a good position to be putting growth regulators into.
So we might just swing back then in terms of the sort of the practical advice, and might maybe take some of them in turn. And for the moment, we'll focus on some of the winter crops. In terms of winter wheat, what would a standard program look like in winter wheat?
Well, if you're on a reasonably low risk situation, we'll take the low risk situation first. A single application, around growth stage 31 or thereabouts, which is round about now, of a CCC modus mix or a CCC Medex Max mix. Can be pretty effective in reducing your risk. If you're in a higher risk situation, you might look at putting on go to a 2 application strategy, where you put on a liter of CCC with a 0.2 of a modus type product, or 0.2 or 0.3 of Medex Max, and at growth stage 30, and come back again around growth stage 31 with a second split. And you always have the option, if you still regard the risk to be high, of coming back later on with something like Turple or Cerrone, recognizing that Turple isn't allowed on straw that's going to be going for mushroom contracts or that. So you just need to be careful with that one as well.
Okay, and turn into winter barley, I suppose, considering the fact, Richie, most winter barleys are probably well past growth stage 31. Some of them actually have the flag leaf probably peeping out maybe at this stage. What's the recommendation at this time of the year now?
Yeah, well, I suppose if you are gone to that stage, you're probably looking at again at a Turple type or product, or maybe a Cerrone type product, because most of the CCC products are the latest time of application on winter barley's growth stage 32. So not all crops, but some crops will be probably past that stage at this stage. If they're not, you have the option of using a similar mix to the winter wheat, a liter of CCC and 0.2 of Modus, or 0.2 or 0.3 of Medex Max, at up to around maybe growth stage 31. But it's getting late for most crops for that mix at this stage, particularly earlier sown and the earlier maturing varieties.
Okay. And we'll in terms of winter oats then, Richie, look, they're only kind of coming through the growth stages. Some of them are quite forward, but I suppose they're all the way from probably touching 31, maybe up to maybe close to 32 now at this stage.
Yeah, I suppose some people will have some growth regulator on oats already, and again, the sort of the normal program in a high risk situation might be again, something similar to the other crops, CCC Modus type mix at growth stage 30, and with the second one follow on at growth stage 32. If for the lower risk situations, something like CCC Modus at growth stage 32 on its own, one shot is good enough, or something like Serade is a popular Serade type product, which is a mixture of CCC and some adjuvants at growth stage 32, can be quite effective. So particularly that product, growth stage 32, 33, when the crop is actively grown, can be very effective. I suppose with all the crops, the important thing, as I mentioned earlier, is that you're putting on the growth regulator when the crop is actively growing. So when it's nice, warm, growthy conditions, that's when you're going to get your best effect. Putting it on in cool conditions, the effect will be diminished to some extent.
And I'd be neglecting it if I went past all the winter crops without mentioning your favorite crop, which is rye. What's the growth regulator scenario for rye?
Well, again, many crops would have already received a first growth regulator on that, and you'd be looking at your growth stage 32 type application with CCC, a litre of CCC, and maybe 0.2 or 0.3 of Medax Max. You could also use the Modux, the Modus mix, and again on if you have the option of going with Ciron later in the season as well, if you still regard it as being a high risk situation. But for many growers to be maybe growing rye for the first time, and they'll see the height of it and be very worried about it. But I would say that the lodging risk of rye isn't as big as you would think from its height, is the experience that I've had over the last 5 or 6 years with it.
Richie, just want to ask you one last question. A lot of spring barley gone in much earlier than we had in the last number of years. There's hopefully really good potential in it. There might be a case where people might argue that for spring barley it's going to be high yielding. Does that need a growth regulator?
That's always a tricky situation with growth regulators on spring barley. Again, the first thing I would do is I would go back to the varieties, and there are a couple of varieties there that would be at higher risk. Everybody will be familiar with the likes of Planet, which can be at risk of lodging, and there are a number of others there as well. So in those high risk varieties, yeah, perhaps you should consider it, but I would be waiting to see how the crop actually looks. Okay, the potential is there at the minute, but let's see how the crops actually look when they get to maybe growth stage 30 or thereabouts, and you have the option of using some of the same type mixes that we mentioned. Not all products are allowed on spring barley. You just need to be careful with the products that you're going to use.
Okay, but I suppose one with the other, Richie, for the most part, generally speaking, a lot of spring barleys generally don't need a growth regulator for the most part.
No, it'd be rare that we would apply growth regulators to any of our crops, spring barley crops in Oak Park. And yeah, it's only if you have a really high risk situation, which is going to be very, very rare for spring barley. People growing malt and barley are not going to be pushing it with nitrogen and things, so it's going to be relatively low risk. And as you say, it's going to be the occasional crop that we should be getting it rather than every crop. And I suppose something I didn't mention with all the other crops is when you asked me conditions to avoid using PGRs, the one that I would avoid as well is using PGRs in complicated tank mixes, because that can lead to a lot of problems. Keep it simple when you're putting together a tank mix with a growth regulator in it. 1 or 2 products is plenty to be putting on at a time when you have a growth regulator in the mix.
Makes sense. Richie, listen, thanks very much for your time. I'm delighted you could join us again. And look, we'll be chatting to you again shortly.
No problem, Michael, anytime.
So that's it for this episode, and my thanks to Richie for joining me on the show. Teagasc are running a large series of spring crop walks starting next week across the country. For more information for these spring crop walks, keep an eye on the teagasc.ie website for further details. So finally, if you enjoyed the podcast, then recommend it to a friend or colleague, and as always, rate, review and follow on Apple or Spotify so you never miss an episode. And for more information, go to teagasc.ie. I'm Michael Hennessy, thanks for listening, and I'll be back next week with more tillage news and advice.